So, what if the biggest, most powerful economies in the world are all following a predictable script? One that ends with them going broke. Today, we're digging into that exact question. We're going to use investor Ray Dalio's historical framework and a pretty stark warning from the World Bank to uncover this hidden cycle of how countries really get into deep financial trouble. So let's just jump right in with this really provocative question from Ray Dalio. I mean, it seems kind of impossible, right, for a powerhouse like the United States to just go broke. But history, as it turns out, shows this painful and, frankly, predictable pattern that even the mightiest empires can't seem to escape. To really get how a country ends up in that kind of mess, we first have to understand a concept Dalio calls the big debt cycle. Honestly, this is the key to the entire puzzle. Now look, we're all pretty used to hearing about short-term recessions, the typical business cycle. But Dalio is pointing to something way larger and, frankly, a lot more dangerous that plays out over 50, even 100 years. During this long cycle, debt just grows, slowly, quietly, almost like a cancer in the economy, until it finally hits a tipping point and the whole thing becomes completely unsustainable. Of course, it's worth noting, this idea isn't without its critics. You have plenty of economists who push back and argue that, history is rarely this neat and tidy. They see that calling these simple, repetitious cycles really oversimplifies a much more complex and messy reality. So what does the peak of one of these huge cycles actually look like in the real world? Well, the 2008 global financial crisis is a perfect case study. And for this, we're going to turn to the hard data from the World Bank. Okay, so the world has seen 4 major global recessions since the 1970s, but they definitely weren't all created equal. The World Bank makes a point to highlight that the 2009 recession was totally unique. It was, by far, the deepest and the most widespread. It was a crisis that pretty much hit everyone, everywhere, all at once. So how in the world did we get there? Well, the stage was basically set for a massive bubble. You had major economies with super low interest rates, what people call accommodative monetary policy. And this created what's known as a search for yield, where investors, desperate for better returns, just poured mountains of capital into developing nations. And to put this into perspective, let's look at the numbers. Back in 2001, all this capital flowing in was just about 1% of the developing world's collective GDP. A pretty manageable stream, right? But by 2007, that stream had turned into a full-blown tidal wave. It swelled all the way to 6.5% of GDP. I mean, that's a nearly 7-fold increase in just 6 years. It inflated this enormous bubble that was just sitting there, built on borrowed money waiting to pop. And when that debt becomes just too much to handle, the system is forced into this really painful but necessary correction. It's called deleveraging. This is the moment where the fantasy of endless borrowing slams into the hard reality of actually having to pay it back. Dalio lays out this classic 6-step playbook for how this whole thing goes down. It starts with the shock, when debt payments become impossible. Then that leads to a depression phase where everybody starts selling off assets and credit just vanishes. This is what forces central banks to step in and, well, print money. The big goal is to achieve what Dalio famously calls a beautiful deleveraging. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act where the stimulus is just enough to offset the pain. And eventually, that leads to a new kind of economic normal. And hey, this isn't just a theory. The World Bank's report shows this exact playbook in action during the 2009 crisis. For the very first time, many of these developing economies used massive countercyclical policies, which is basically a fancy way of saying they spent a ton of money to fight the downturn, just like the model predicts. But there's a classic problem that can stop a recovery cold. Economists have a great name for it: pushing on a string. This is when central banks make money super cheap, but people and businesses are just too scared to borrow or spend it. They just hoard cash instead, and all that stimulus money just fizzles out. So, this all brings us to the most crucial question. What did we actually learn from 2008, and are we ready for the next storm? The data from the World Bank suggests the answer is a pretty resounding no. In fact, we might be more vulnerable today than we have been in a long, long time. The difference between then and now is just stark. Before the 2009 crisis, developing economies had built up these financial buffers. They had lower debt, smaller deficits, but the World Bank's analysis shows that today, those financial cushions, those shock absorbers, they're almost completely gone, and that leaves them dangerously exposed. I mean, just look at the government debt numbers. In 2007, the average was 41% of GDP in these economies. By 2018, that had jumped all the way to 54%. That huge leap means they have far less fiscal space, or to put it simply, way less room to borrow and spend their way out of the next crisis. And let's be clear, this isn't just speculation. This whole analysis is grounded in the World Bank's incredibly comprehensive report, which is what provides the hard, data-driven evidence for all these growing global risks. So, if our defenses are down, what does that mean for the next downturn? This is where the story starts to get really concerning. This warning, which comes from the foreword to the World Bank report, really says it all. With fewer buffers than they had in 2008, these economies are particularly vulnerable. The simple, hard truth is that the world is less prepared for a shock now than it was for the last one. And this vulnerability, this weakness, is happening at a uniquely dangerous time. Dalio identifies 5 massive forces that are all converging at once. It's not just the debt cycle, but also intense internal political conflict, rising tensions between nations, the unpredictable effects of climate change, and of course, disruptive new technology. Each one of these just adds another layer of risk to an already fragile system. And all of that leaves us with the one question that should really be on everyone's mind. Our financial cushions are gone. New risks are piling up from every single direction. So, are we actually ready for what comes next?